Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we are talking about time cards. We are going to be having a delightful time playing with time. So we are going to be looking at all the cards in Expeditions, or rather in the new set, Flame of Xulta. We're not going to be looking at legendaries since we already did legendaries. It'll just be rares and commons, and potentially promo cards from Flame of Xulta as well, although there aren't really that many of those, so probably won't be too many. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about them. So we're going to be basically going over each one, talking about draft and draft, expeditions, and ranked, where these cards go, whether or not they're good in any decks, or like if there are specific decks that they might go into, and whether or not we have like a high opinion of them, think they're going to do pretty well. I'm turning around quite a bit on emblems. I think they're quite powerful in general. There are still lots of places where you don't want to run emblems, but I would say that Emblem of Reap is definitely one of the strong ones. All of them are pretty good. I would say the green one is probably the least likely to be beneficial in a ranked environment, but I'm finding Emblem of Reap to be pretty handy in Cultist decks and other formats because it's something that actually functions really well as a sacrifice target due to the fact that when you draw a 2/2 Earth Elemental for decimating your power, which is to say reducing your power by 1, you then get a decent 2/2 weapon to put on something, and that can be really solid when that card dies. So yeah, this is pretty strong. It's up there in terms of like overall stats for value and power. The 3/3 has like a wild amount of stats. The 2/2 trades really evenly. The Shadow 2/2 trades really evenly. The Primal one has that Aegis, which is I think a little less useful, but can be very handy in an expedition environment. And this one has the sacrifice ability, which I think is really handy. In both ranked and expeditions, I think this card is really strong. And like overall, this just seems like a really strong card, in particular for expeditions. In draft, you absolutely want it. It's a lovely exalted card. Emblems are great in draft. They're just like really good cards that allow you to easily counter out Flood while also getting like a good decimate target for free. Especially in Justice and Shadow, those are really handy. But yeah, Emblem of Reap is great. All of the emblems are like super powered rares. They're probably one of the like must craft rares of the set. I would say power rares are usually the most important to craft in the set, and these are like a good one on your list if you want to be looking for them. Reap, you gain 3 health, decimate, gain red, yellow, green, blue, and purple. I was excited about this card until I found out that you couldn't decimate at 0 power, because it does have a lot of interesting sort of potential synergies if you want to get like a bunch of red available in a very short period of time. So yeah, this card does give you a wild amount of influence, allowing you to play 5-color aggro in really weird ways. If you have a bunch of different 1-drops that really synergize well together, I think that's actually kind of the place that you want to work with it. Basically just getting into a bunch of different colors, playing whatever you like out of that, then reaping and getting all of the necessary colors to play whatever it is that you need. If you want to really get deep into 5 different colors, that's also a possibility for Reap, but that decimate is still pretty hard. The other notable thing about it is that it is cheap life gain, which you can use to trigger certain other things, like if you want to very quickly start a means to an end combo or do something else that's a little bit ridiculous. Reap definitely has a little bit of potential there just because it's the fastest life gain that you can possibly generate. In both ranked and expeditions, I don't think this card is very strong, but it is a combo card, so wouldn't count it out if there is a deck that can actually do something with it. Speed is pretty important. We have just been playing with a delightful Cultist deck that we are going to be showing off, I think, before even this brew comes out, and this is an interesting card for that list that I actually passed up. Overall, not very powerful, pretty bad in all 3 formats, but definitely has that one place in a combo deck that could be really interesting. Ardent Convert, 1/1 Exalted, straight up Cultist. So yeah, the joke here is that why does green get everything better? They get like a 1/1 something Paladin with Exalted. The answer is that Cultists with Exalted are actually quite a bit stronger than Paladins with Exalted and Lifesteal. If you are looking for sacrifice targets, you're looking for them in Cultists. You want to be able to throw Cultists for High Priest of Soul. You want to be able to throw Cultists for Zenzu. That being said, this card is still not amazingly strong, but I would say that it does have enough Cultist synergies that outweighs the fact that it doesn't have lifesteal in time or lifesteal in Justice, which is a thing that happens. Overall, like, yeah, this card's pretty decent. Like, you can definitely do some wild things with it. It's pretty strong. But like, just like only in like a draft environment. I would say that like ranked doesn't really have a place for it at all. Expeditions definitely has some places where you might want a 1/1 that you can sacrifice for a small beneficial effect, a little +1/+1 bonus. I got momentarily distracted there by some background noise, but we're all good. Arc of Soul, sacrifice a unit to play a sigil of your choice from your deck depleted and gain 2 health. Bargain, hit the enemy player with the Cultist. For my money, this is the strongest of the bargains. It's just really, really easy to play. You can play it in your main board without a lot of issue, meaning that you have a lot of access to a lot of other things. Notably, you can't play 3 copies in your main and then 1 in your market, which is a little bit rough, but like I would say that it's kind of interesting in Expeditions still, and if you're playing in ranked, then you can do that. The main problem being, of course, that Smugglers and Bargain don't work together, because if you've got 3 copies in your main and then you've got a copy in your market, and then you have Smugglers won't allow Arc of Soul in your market because of the copies in your main board. So you can only run 1 in your market with Smugglers, which makes it a little bit worse on the overall value that it offers. But it's still a really strong market card, easy to throw in, gives you an easy ramp that also fixes power in time with Cultists. There's a ton of different Cultist synergy decks that are going to use this card. It's really, really strong. It plays well in ranked, it plays well in Expedition, and it even plays well in draft. Like, you just play this in your main board, you're fine with it. It's not a bad sacrifice effect. You can play it with the 1/1 Cultist with Exalted and get like that benefit without even having to hit the enemy player. So yeah, it's a reasonable rare to pick up, but not like amazing. I would just say it's a rare that you would pick over a lot of commons and uncommons for sure. So certainly on the strong side, very, very interesting in Expeditions and ranked. Aspirant's Robes. Summon, create, and draw a 1/1 Cultist. Spellcraft 4, play Patience. Notable for being a really cheap weapon that also plays a Cultist. Both of those things are actually really relevant. It is a Cultist that is not a Cultist, which does matter for a number of different cards that want to mill Cultists, such as High Priest of Soul and Zenzu, all of which really, really care if the unit is a Cultist. I think that's the only thing that keeps this card out of ranked and Expeditions, is the fact that it isn't in itself a Cultist weapon or anything like that. Currently, we do not have tribal weapons of any kind, so this is just something where you get the Cultist and that's a decent benefit. But like straight up the 1-drop 1/1 with a little extra effect is actually not a bad deal. This is kind of on curve with the card Ornamental Daggers, which is also a decently strong option. It's not quite the same, but the Spellcraft kind of pushes it over the edge a little bit. Patience is not a card that you can really play in ranked or Expeditions, but it is a card you could play off a Spellcraft weapon, and if you're playing it on like a little Lifestealer or trying to get over with something that has Infiltrate, if you're just trying to get like that little extra bonus and like you actually manage to get the Spellcraft off as well and shut off your opponent's like counter spells and other options, I think that's interesting. I think that card actually would be really interesting in Expedition or Ranked. But yeah, it's held back a little bit by the stat line. I don't know if there's an Expedition or Ranked deck that wants to run it yet. It does have the muster trigger, and it has the muster trigger at 5. Most Spellcraft weapons have the muster trigger at 5, so that doesn't really go in its favor as well. But it's interesting as a card that plays weapons and units simultaneously. So there's certainly some benefit to that, but it's not quite strong enough for Expedition or Ranked. Draft-wise, this card's pretty good. I would say that both the health, the Spellcraft, and the Cultist that it draws are all really useful, and this is a pretty strong thing to put on a number of different units to trigger Renowns, to trigger extra health for Twist, to trigger basically any number of interesting effects, including ones that care about weapons. I like this card a lot in draft. I think it's pretty decent, but you do have to have a couple of synergies with it, so it's only a medium pick. Borderlands Lookout, 0/1, +1/+1 for each type of influence the enemy player has. Usually quite strong. We've already seen Expedition decks that just roll people with this. I would say Ranked also has plenty of decks that can do that, although Ranked is a little bit more prone to interesting monocolor decks, or at least interesting dual color decks that make Borderlands Lookout look a little less attractive in the face of many, many value cards. Overall, though, this card is strong in all 3 formats. It's a very good uncommon. The +1/+1 for each type of influence is just very powerful. The main risk to the card, of course, is that it gets silenced, but because it's a 1-drop, you are really not worried about anything getting thrown at Borderlands Lookout. Like, if something gets thrown at Borderlands Lookout, fine, you do lose some board status, but you didn't really spend a lot to get that card out. It came out on curve on 1, and then you got into your 2-drop, which is probably just as dangerous. This card's insane. It basically synergizes really, really well. There are some ways to play around it, often making it a 1/2 until your like 2/2 is on the ground, keeping it from attacking early on. It might lose a little bit of attack in that respect. You have to play around Borderlands Lookout in draft and ranked and Expedition, but a 1-drop that you have to play around is still pretty good, and on the times when you ignore it and you feel the sort of presence of it, I think that's a pretty big deal as well. Like overall, this card is just very, very strong. Ends up being a 3/4 most of the time. Sometimes is a 2/3. That's probably the most common effect. Very rarely a 1/2, and even when it is, I mean, it's a 1/2 for 1. Who cares? It's still an elf. It's still an explorer. It's still got insane synergies. Like, it's got great just unit. It's got great stats, it's got 2 great subtypes that actually work well together, and it's got like a very, very minimal cost. It's good in all 3 formats, nothing wrong with it. Metal. Give one of your units invulnerable to damage this turn. So this is sort of a draft trick for any sort of mastery benefits. You can really get a lot done with it. It is actually pretty good at trading up and also triggering mastery at the same time. It's not on par with removal in draft, but I would say that it is a strong combat trick that is just a little bit worse than cards like Finest Hour, Draw Strength, and all of the other stuff. Like, in general, you want tricks, so this is certainly not unreasonable to pick, particularly if you have a high variety of mastery effects, but also it also has some interesting things going on, like you can use it to prevent lifesteal, which is pretty important to know. Invulnerable to damage prevents lifesteal, it prevents other masteries from triggering. It generally just like makes a couple of things work in your favor in some interesting ways. That being said, it's pretty low power in draft and it's not really viable in Expedition or Ranked. There may be a specific deck that really wants invulnerable damage, but on this scale, at this speed, like it's fast, but even so, I'm just not sure that it's tempo efficient enough to really benefit in Ranked or Expeditions. I can see it in Expeditions at like kind of a low pick. In Ranked, just no, not gonna happen. But draft-wise, it's a reasonable to mid to low pick, not too bad, but certainly, you know, something that you aren't gonna pick until you at least have units to put it on. Xulta Brushfang, Mastery 2 Deadly, Mastery 4+3/+3. Another really, really strong 1-drop in Time. Time's got a lot of good aggressive 1-drops. This one's very strong in Expeditions and it's very strong in Draft. I would not play it in Ranked just because like the ability to get through with this is a lot harder, I think, in a Ranked environment. And also, once it actually gets its Mastery up, people are going to be a little bit more prepared to deal with it. So getting Mastery 2 on this is a little tricky. That's the main problem with Xulta Brushfang, is that you kind of have to play decent removal or at least some tricks to get Xulta Brushfang off the ground. But once you get the Mastery 4, you have a unit that is like absolutely absurd, even better than Borderlands Lookout. So the high end of the curve is really, really strong, and you can get to that just by playing a Draw Strength or a Stand Strong or something along those lines that'll actually get you a big ol' like huge unit. So yeah, there's some pretty decent options there. I think this card tends to upgrade pretty well, usually trades pretty well as a 1/2 Deadly, forces your opponent into bad situations. In Draft, this is a relatively high pick. In Expeditions, it's middle of the road. In Ranked, it just doesn't play at all. You're not going to get it across because Torch exists, and Torch is happy to get rid of this. Still, it's a 1-drop that has like some mastery going on, so if you could play a mastery deck in Ranked, that might work. Not too many mastery decks in Ranked right now that I know of. Chantagrota, if each unit in your hand gets +1/+1 and Overwhelm. I've seen this card work in Draft. I certainly don't think it's an unreasonable pick, but I would pick it pretty low. If you have a big handful of cards, it's similar to Warbrush Oni in that it gives you a decent amount of benefits as long as you have cards in hand. That's really unreliable, though, and can frequently not go your way. I do think that this is really strong if you do get it off on a big hand of cards, similar to Ageless Mentor, but because it doesn't build on its own board and it's replacing a 2-drop, which is probably the most important drop in Ranked right now. Like, yeah, 3-drops are really, really important as well, but 2-drops are pretty critical to prevent masteries from going off, so strong 2-drops really do make a big difference there. I would say that Chantagrota is fine, but like I wouldn't play it in Expeditions, I wouldn't play it in Ranked, and I would not usually pick it in Draft, but it can definitely work if you got the right brand of like really unit heavy, no removal, just need to push across and do as much damage as possible. Didn't get any better spells. Chantagrota will definitely do some work. And that's not to say there aren't combos with it. The card definitely does have some strengths on that front. Greta Evangel. 2/2 charge, fate, gain time influence. So good fixers. This is one of the decently strong options. It's a good aggressive card. Time already has a lot of aggression going on, and Growth Evangel kind of helps with that. Helps out like Timekeeper and a couple of other influence effects. Not a major deal, but could be useful depending on what you're looking for. And always comes down for 2 damage in Fire, which is reasonable but not amazing in Expedition. I would say this card is probably not strong enough for Ranked. It just doesn't really have the stat line for it, and the Fate ability is not as useful as many of the other ways to fix in Time. It doesn't really compete super well with cards like Trailmaker and other like interestingly good ramp cards and fixers. So like overall, I'm not high on this card in those formats. In draft, this is like a really reasonable pick. High to average, I would say it's very, very strong just because like she's very good at doing a bunch of other things. People are saying she's good in Charge Rod. Yeah, that seems right. I'm certainly not going to say that's not true, but yeah, like overall, like I don't think there's too many decks that this card belongs in. Just having Charge is about the only reason to run it, I would say. Okay. High Prophetess Soul, +1 maximum power. When another cultist goes to your void, +1 maximum power. This one ended up being stronger than, like, even maybe Trailmaker. It's been really ridiculous in almost every deck that I've seen it in. In Expeditions, it's just so hard to kill. Like, there are not that many things that can just easily kill a 0/3. Most of the units have 2 attack, so it actually does block and defend pretty frequently, and if your opponent has to spend some, like, actual removal on it, that means they're not spending on a bunch of other things. The maximum power that it gives you is frequent, common, and very, very strong. Zenzu is triggering this very often. Sunset Priest triggers it a bunch. You can just play decks full of cultists and get amazing amounts of power, and that means that it's an activator for cards like Nahid, which allows you to just play out a 7/7 on like turn 3 or 4, provided you have the correct influence, which you usually will because Xenon Insignia is a thing. This card only goes in cultist-heavy decks in Expeditions and in Ranked, but in Expedition it's a pretty high pick, and in Ranked it is better than average, very, very strong, and it also even adds up to other extra maximum power stuff. The 0/3 body is definitely not as beneficial. It's still very torchable. The fact that it doesn't fix influence would actually make it a little lower than Trailmaker in Ranked, but in Expedition, like, this card is amazing because cultists are really powerful, and High Prophetess Soul is a huge cultist boon. Like, I think this card's amazing. So yeah, really, really good in Expedition, very, very solid in Draft. You do have to play a few cultists, but like I would say that even in draft, like this just a 0/3 wall that gives you +1 maximum power and gets you up to the big stuff is really nice. And then like in ranked, it's okay. It's not amazing, but if you're playing a cultist deck, sure, have at it. Snapping Hydrangea. Summon. The enemy player plays 4 1/1 cultists. Lots of things you can do with this. So notably, it's a good activator for like void-based effects on your opponent. If you can like do like blue-purple and do something like a malediction or something, your opponent now has a bunch of dead things in their void, which may be beneficial to you later on. This card's hard to run. Certainly, the enemy player playing 4 1/1 cultists is way better than you having a 5/5. Like, you are just generally not happy if you are doing this and not getting rid of the cultists very easily and very incidentally. In Ranked, this plays pretty well in sort of, I would say, Elysian decks. Storm Spiral, the new Tamaris, who I'm not sure if she is an Expedition card. I'm pretty sure she's not. But anything that like kills all of the cultists while also leaving you at the 5/5s mean that you have a 2-cost 5/5, a 3-cost 5/5, a 4-cost 5/6, a 5-cost 6/6 that turns everything that it attacks into hot nonsense. Like, mid-range Elysian stuff is wild, and apparently New Tamaris is also in Expedition, so that seems like a reasonable setup. Obviously you can get really, really punished for this, but yeah, it's interestingly strong, and you can also play it with Livia. That's true. A Xenon card, Snapping Hydrangea, attacks in, you get maybe like 1 cultist block, and your opponent's like, I'm just going to chump block. You play down Livia, you knock all the cultists out of the park, and maybe even a couple of your opponent's cultists on top of it. That could be decently strong, but yeah, this card's not amazing to work with overall. Still, decently strong in Expedition, very specific deck. Okay in Ranked, really specific deck. And then in Draft, like, you can't really pick it unless you have exactly the right tools. If you pick it very, very early, you can get the right tools. If you have the right tools, you can pick it late. But like, I would say either way, you're not picking this super highly. Spiketail Kirin. Pay 6 to give it +4/+4 this turn. Mastery 6, your units get +1/+1. I don't think this is viable in Ranked, but I do think in Expeditions it's a pretty strong Mastery card. Like, does a decent amount. It's not as strong as most of the Mastery effects, and can get outshone a little bit by Verit, who is just kind of absurd. Like, that card is just wildly good in comparison to a lot of other things. I'm just baffled by that colorless card being so good. But yeah, pay 6 to give it +4/+4 this turn. It then immediately can give you Mastery 6. Your units get +1/+1. That rally effect is really, really handy in draft. The pay 6 ability is even more handy in draft and will frequently be the bane of your opponent's whole day. Spiketail Kieran is a card that almost doesn't want to trade most of the time because the pay 6 ability is so good. That being said, it's still kind of inefficient. You don't always get the best +1/+1 benefits. Like getting a 3/3 late in the game, not that useful. So if your opponent's killing all of your other stuff and not killing Kieran, this card is modest to okay. In Expedition, I would say average. In Ranked, unplayable. In Draft, this card is pretty strong and a pretty high pick over even Evangels for like your base 2 drops. So good stuff. Unmake. Kill an enemy attachment, decimate, kill an additional enemy attachment. Strong, easy removal that destroys exalted cards, which is a pretty big deal. You might want to pick this in draft if you don't have good silences or ways to deal with exalted cards. The exalted sort of Voltron is the thing to undo and the thing to answer in draft right now. People might start moving away from it if people actually start drafting Unmake, because this card is very, very strong against those strategies, but also like it's still pretty hard to run just straight attachment removal, even if it comes with the possibility of a 2-for-1 on 2 attachments. A 2-for-1 on 2 attachments, it's an okay market card in Expeditions. It's probably not an okay market card in Ranked. It's like kind of on the line with Disjunction, but like a very specific use, and I would say Passage of Eons is really filling that hole right now. And then draft-wise, it's a lowish pick that definitely seems reasonable if you don't have a good answer to exalted cards. Eager Offering. Start of your turn, sacrifice Eager Offering to draw 2 cards. There are many ways in which Eager Offering is better than Wisdom of the Elders. It's a 0/4. It requires your opponent to spend removal on it, which is their most important card, which they usually aren't going to do. They're usually just going to let you draw the cards, or they're going to do something tricky. While it's down, it will defend you against the board and also force tricks out of your opponent's hand that way. So trading 1-for-1, not too bad for Eager Offering, because you're usually at least getting 1 card to deal with this card. The main problem is Incidental Silence, which makes it completely unplayable in Ranked and a little bit risky in Expedition, but not enough so to actually do anything crazy. But like in both Draft and Expedition, you plop this card down, suddenly you are blocking a good amount of damage, so you're gaining life in addition to drawing your cards. You then draw your cards, and it didn't cost you as much influence. You get a Cultist in your Void, which matters for High Prophet of Soul, Nahid, and a number of other cards that care about how many cards you have in your Void. And then you also get to draw 2 cards, which is, yeah, that is a Wisdom of the Elders in time. I think that's a pretty strong effect. The obvious weakness to Silence and the chance that you might get removed and you're giving your opponent choices means that it's mediocre but still pretty good in Expedition and bad in Ranked. But draft-wise, this card is very, very good and is just like probably the strongest draw in the format right now, or at least in Limited. There are other options, but this one just really works very well, and like I would pick it over Wisdom of the Elders. Edict of Grodoff. Put an enemy unit or spell into its owner's hand. If it's primal or shadow, put it on the bottom of its owner's deck instead, which removes it pretty much for good and also turns off the Void. So this is the costliest edict, but I would say that overall it definitely does some things. Like it's certainly on board with a number of different options. Like you get a lot of flexibility out of it. It is a fast spell, so you get to use it as a trick. It kills a unit, but it also gets rid of all the stuff on top of the unit, which is very, very good against exalted piles. This card's a very strong pick in draft. It's just like really, really solid at getting rid of the big exalted nonsense in like red and green. And then in blue and purple, it not only does that, but it also kills the unit, which is a big, big deal. And it counters spells, which is just like a nice side effect. Like if your opponent has something very big, that's something you really, really want. I picked this card very, very highly in draft. In Expedition, I like it. In Ranked, it's too slow, I think. But yeah, like for time removal, this is certainly not unreasonable. And the fact that it is fast and also like really expensive is like fast, but not too expensive, I would say. It means that it's usually pretty reasonable. I think this card's pretty strong. Mediocre Expedition, very, very good draft card. Ranked-wise, no. Proselytize. Play 2 1/1 cultists. Decimate, create, and draw 2 additional 1/1 cultists. Very, very powerful draft card. Gets you a lot of tokens. Those tokens then get benefited by Horn of Plenty, by Nahid's Faithful, by Zenzu, by any number of things that care about cultists, by Marsh Dragon. There's so many different things in Xenon and even Stonescar, and like also the 3-color sort of pairing, which I'm not sure what we're calling that right now. It might be Grodoff. It might be, let's see here. It's not Grodoff, it's, I think it's the Shadow one. I can't remember the name of it right now. Makar, I think. Yeah, like this is a reasonable option that like actually gets you a wide variety of small tokens that do some pretty crazy things. You can play it with Barbarian Camp, yeah. Fire, Time, and Shadow is usually where it belongs, but I would say that it is just a really reasonable option to play those 2 cultists, and it's usually a very good option to decimate, even though like the decimation may end up like making it a little hard to play those cultists and also play other cards. But yeah, this gives you a ton of chump blockers, which means it gives you a lot of extra draws to get to a card you really need. It also gives you a bunch of sacrifice fodder for many, many different cards that care about sacrifice fodder. There are not many cards like this in draft, and this is a really strong one to pick. I like it even more than Nahid's Choice as an option. I think that it's just that much stronger with those 2 additional cultists and the decimate effect. Like that decimate is something you actually go for pretty frequently. So yeah, this card's really, really good in draft. In Expedition, it is okay. In Ranked, yeah, it's fine. You can do it with Vault of the Praxis, do a couple of things. I like it with Vault of the Praxis because it is one of the only Vault of the Praxis cards that will actually get you 2 Vault of the Praxis triggers. So you can play the 2 cultists immediately, and then you get 2 more to play into the next Vault of the Praxis, or even to pair with other units to continually praxis every turn. I think that's really strong, and combined with like Xenon Obelisk and other nonsense, like yeah, this card's a winner in pretty much all 3 formats. It's not amazingly strong, however. I would not say it's like top tier or anything. I would say this is like a 2nd-tier card in all 3 of those formats, but it's still something that you pick pretty highly in all of them, and I like it pretty evenly in all of them. Swaying Seacurin, muster, create and draw a 1/1 humbug with flying. Yeah, this card's okay in draft because it has like that nice body and like it's actually defensive, but being a big fat thing that sits there on the ground and defends your flyers is no longer really an option because there's so many cards that have mastery. And that means that there are not only a lot of ways to sort of walk over Kieran, but also a lot of ways to like sort of just be okay with slamming into Kieran over and over again every turn. This card's passivity is pretty bad, and the Humbug is not a great muster payoff because muster is such a hard thing to do. I don't value this card high in Expedition. This card is unplayable in Ranked, and in Draft it is a mediocre pick just for that body, but like it's not doing anything special for you in the 3-drop slot. I'd probably rather have a 3/3. Wilderness Refuge, +1 maximum power, spellcraft 3, play Lost in the Mist. Strong enough in draft for triggering muster effects. Lost in the Mist is a pretty beneficial removal card, and it's usually worth it to go to 6 for it. And if you want to ramp up to like 6 drops in general, then Wilderness Refuge will help you get there. Yeah, it's about middle of the pack. Expedition, I'd find this card hard to play even if you're playing a muster-heavy deck. Ranked, it's just not possible at all. You wouldn't want to run this card. It's okay for muster triggers, but there's got to be a lot of better options there that don't cost 6, and the +1 maximum power, while it sets up other musters, is minimal here, I would say. Cult Recruiter, Ambush, Mastery 4 +1/+1. This is a removal card. If you're playing draft and your opponent is open and they have 4 power up and they're in time, don't attack into this. This is a very, very common draft trick that everyone needs to learn and needs to know about. Once people know about it, I think this card will not be as strong as it currently is. It is just a pretty good card to slam onto like a 2/2, eat the 2/2, then attack in and get a 4/4. Yeah, that's a really nice deal. It's also a cultist, which is just like icing on the cake as far as things go. Like, yeah, this card's got a lot of cool things going on. His voice line is also, "Have you heard the good word?" which is amazing. I love the idea of an ambush creature just jumping out with a like tome and trying to preach religion. It's very, very good, and then they kill you. It's a lot. It's very, very solid. I like this card quite a bit in draft. In Expedition, I wouldn't really play it, and in Ranked, it definitely doesn't have the stats to work. So, but yeah, I would pick it reasonably highly in draft. Not too high, but it's up there. Waystone Fragment. Units have +1/+1. Spellcraft 3. Play Gathering Lights. 7 spellcraft is tricky, but this card is still stronger than all of the other faux obelisks. So Obelisk is definitely the strongest still. But there are situations in both Ranked and Expedition where you would play a Waystone Fragment over a Xenon Obelisk, and that is just because the Gathering Lights ability gives you a lot of health. It also gives you 2 units that actually count with Waystone Fragments. So, like, as an example, like, Xenon Obelisk gives you +1/+1 to all your units, and that's going to be an additional +1/+1 if you get to 8. So you get, like, you know, like maybe an additional, like, +2/+2 on 2 units. If you have 2 units and you're getting +2/+2 on them, and you play a Gathering Lights instead, you get a little bit of more stats, and you get like the same amount of stats out of that as if you'd had just like 2 units. So unless you're playing a lot of different units, Xenon Obelisk like won't actually measure out quite as well in terms of trading. That's a poor explanation, but like basically the math on it does actually work out favorably compared to Xenon Obelisk due to its lower cost and the fact that it gives you something to block with and attack with, and also to trigger Vault of the Praxis with, which is really, really wild. Xenon Obelisk still has the way better late game and also gives you just like so much more strength in the late game, but like this is a card that actually keeps you alive for longer while you're doing your Xenon Obelisk stuff, and that is actually something that is reasonable in Ranked, very, very good in Expeditions, and yeah, certainly a strong draft card to pick up. Creating units and also giving +1/+1 is so insane in draft. This is a really high pick on that front. Vine Petal Creeper, muster +4/+4 in endurance this turn. I wouldn't say this is good enough to play in Expeditions. The stat line is just so weak. It's definitely not strong enough in Ranked. It's a cool muster, and the muster ability is definitely borderline playable in draft. But like also, I kind of want this card to be a 5/5 that has a muster +3/+3 in endurance this turn, because like you need to have that synergy with Sauropod Wrangler to really kind of justify this card. Other than that, I think it's fine. Like the baseline stats are just not strong enough, so it's not usually working out quite as well. I've picked this card multiple times in draft and been okay with it. It's not great, but it's something that you can do to top your curve. There are better 5-drop options out there. Grodos Favored. Summon, you may silence another unit. It is a 6/5. This is the strongest common in draft, I think. At least in the previous format, it definitely was. So silencing units is very, very strong. Like this is really, really good in draft environments because that's something you want. B, it has the stat line that you want out of a big giant at the cost that you want. Like you are okay with it being a 6/5 over a 6/6. That's still going to trade with the majority of other units. Take a look at Vine Petal Creeper, for example. Grodos Favored is bigger than that card unless that card is doing its endurance thing. And also Grodos Favored is silencing that card, so it's not doing its endurance thing. This card turns off a flyer and gives you a big guy on the board to trade with said flyer and any other units your opponent might have. It almost always 2-for-1s, sometimes it even 3-for-1s. It's really, really powerful on curve. This is the kind of curve topper I want, and 6-drop is just the high end of affordable for this format. I value it a little bit lower in Expeditions if I'm running a lot of Decimates, because it's hard to get to 6 with Decimate, but yeah, this card is quite good, and like I would say that this is definitely the best common in draft. In Expedition, I would probably not play it just because it's very, very close to a vanilla unit, but it's kind of online with like Archive Curator and some other things. If you really need a silence in your deck, it's really not that bad to have it at 6. Maybe an Expedition as a low pick. In Ranked, it's just not viable. There's way too many other ways to silence things that are cheaper and more stat efficient, Valkyrie Enforcer being the chief amongst them. Majestic Mandrake. Overwhelm, muster, you gain 5 health. Another good competitor for the Grodos Favored slot. I'd still pick Grodos Favored over it, but like the Overwhelm on a 7/5 is a pretty wild stat line, and the fact that this card gains you health makes it the Sauropod Behemoth of the belching, is it, which behemoth is it? It's the 4/6 that twists to gain life. It's that exact card. Lots and lots of good stats. The ability to attack offensively while also giving you lots of health defensively. Corrupted Behemoth is what it's called. Yeah, this card's very good. You definitely want to pick it if you got the musters for it. If you don't have the musters for it, Grodos Favored is stronger, and I think Grodos Favored is stronger even if you do have the musters for it, but I'm not 100% certain of that. Nonetheless, Overwhelm is a really, really big thing on a card like this. Like, it just gives you a lot of reach in draft. This card is too expensive for Expedition or Ranked. I don't think a muster deck really wants to run it. Especially since the muster, once again, is not a high payoff. And if you don't have a good payoff for muster, you shouldn't be running a muster deck in a constructed list. Marizo, Gladiator Hero, Exalted, Mastery 10, play 3 units from the top 10 cards of your deck, discard the rest. Well, this card will destroy anyone in draft. It is an absolute bomb that will pretty frequently get its mastery. Doesn't take a lot. Like, this is not a card that even has to be, like, like, you can't even block it because it's mastery. So you can't chump it. It's just going to get a bunch of cards and then play them. That's a really, really big deal. At least it mills you, but I would say in draft this is one of the strongest rares. There's just too much going on with this. It's got Exalted, so it's really, really hard to kill without getting a giant weapon off of it. The mastery ability is really nice. Yeah, this card's very strong in draft. It's pretty dang good in Expeditions, though a little bit expensive. And then in Ranked, it's probably not going to work. You're probably going to get it silenced or feeding timed or something, but it's worth a shot at least if you want to play a really interesting mastery deck that does something crazy. Yeah, this card has some weird synergies. Like, I'm not sure how good it is with Omri Dragonsbane, because Omri Dragonsbane would play that ability like 2 more times, which would mill you for 30. That could be a little rough, but probably isn't. It's more online with like Tavrod, where you don't lose if that happens. But if you do get harsh ruled after that, you feel a little bit weird, so that's crazy stuff. All right. Last but not least, Mountain Goliath. While Mountain Goliath is in your hand, it gets +2/+2 each time you draw another unit. This is the least of the 7s, but it's still pretty interesting. I like this card in draft. It definitely becomes like an enormous vanilla unit. In Expedition and Ranked, it's probably too slow. The one deck that I would play this in is like an Expedition deck that kind of wants to like play a bunch of creatures and has Savagery. If you're like a Legion, you're playing a bunch of dudes, you're okay with like drawing tons and tons of cards off of your Wisdom of the Elders and your other stuff. You're just playing stock mid-range, and then you have to, like, you are looking for, like, a really interesting slam at the end of that game. Then you play a 22/22 Mountain Goliath, you Savagery it, you smash your opponent's 1/1, and you kill them. That's the one thing that I can think of for it in Expedition. Otherwise, even the biggest vanilla unit is still a vanilla unit. It's still going to have a lot of other problems going on with it. But if you can give this card Overwhelm in Expedition and also make it attack quickly, those two things are good enough to play it in Expedition. I wouldn't play it in Ranked, but yeah, it's a fun card in draft. It's a good finisher. The main problem with it is that it is kind of a slow finisher, and 7 is a really high cost to pay. Like, that's a cost you're willing to pay for something like Marizo, Gladiator Hero, but for Mountain Goliath, you have to give up a lot of decimates to really make that work. And there's potential that this card is not going to do an amazing amount of things for you. Like, even Proselytize, which gets you like 2 units and then gets a +4/+4 on it, decimates, which makes it harder to cast this card. There's a lot of ways that that's not going to work out for you. I would say it's a mid to high pick in draft. If you have it in draft, you have a finisher at least, and that's something you do need. But if you've got other ways to finish the game, you don't pick this. So, but yeah, Expedition, just that one particular thing. There might be something else cool you can do with a unit that large, and like, so growing that unit is a really fun deck design. So I encourage people to try it, but I don't think it's going to be a tier 1 list or anything like that. Still, really fun card, very well designed, uncommon. If you want to play like pauper decks that are like, if you want to play decks that are just like cheap and have like lots of good stuff in like control setups, this is the kind of thing that you do to like get an edge over like players who have like more expensive stuff. Sometimes they just can't deal with a really large vanilla unit like this. So fun little thing to do. And yeah, really interesting, and I like this card's design a lot. It's another fun like fate effect that's a little bit inverted, and yeah, there's a lot of good things going on with it. All right, that's all the time cards. So I believe next is Justice. We'll be talking about those soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers.